and the Queen's Speech. It's arguably the poshest set of wheels on the market, and by driving one, it does your street cred the world of good. But how did the story start? Well, for that, we need to go back to the 1950s. You see, Land Rover were worried that the initial fantastic appetite for the original Land Rover would eventually slow down, and customers would want something less Animal Farm and more Lord of the Manor, a car that was more comfortable and didn't shake your teeth out. Various designs and names were considered, like Road Rover, but eventually the Range Rover as we know it came together in the late 1960s. And then they hit upon this. The boxy silhouette is now iconic, and the car we have here is the 1970 Range Rover in its purest form. However, technically, this isn't a Range Rover.
So what we've got here is a 1969 Velar. And I say Velar because that is the correct way to pronounce the name. Now, the new car is called Velar, for reasons nobody really can tell me, but the original is called Velar. The name Velar came about because Land Rover wanted to disguise the new Range Rover. They didn't want to call it Range Rover and have prototypes driving around the country bearing the name Range Rover on the bonnet. So they came up with this plan of calling it Velar. So they took the letters from other cars, from Elvis and Rover, and called it Velar. Now, the origin of the word Velar comes from the Spanish velar and the Italian word velare, which means to cover, to conceal. All 7 prototype Velars were crushed, but a further 27 pre-production cars were built, and this is one of them.
Extensive testing took place with those Velars, and the Range Rover was eventually launched on the 17th of June 1970 for £1,998. It was an immediate sales hit because it had no rivals. Not only did it appeal to farmers, but also to buyers of prestige cars who wanted a go-anywhere estate car. Very quickly, the Range Rover became a status symbol. And a Range Rover was even on show in the Louvre in Paris because it was considered a work of art. It was the car of the moment.
It is an absolute peach to drive. Now, up front is Rover's ubiquitous Buick 3.5 litre V8, and it is so smooth. It makes a most wonderful noise as well, and it gave the Range Rover enough power to actually plough through fields and up mountains and through streams and fords that the Range Rover has become so famous and well known for. Now, to drive this Velar, it does feel very different from a modern day Range Rover, what with its thin metal steering wheel and velour seats, but one thing that remains identical, and it's the driving position. Now, you look out over this square bonnet and somehow you just feel better than everybody else on the road. It still drives along with this sort of majestic waft as well. It is absolutely glorious. Now, this Velar is the Range Rover at its most pure, because from here on in, the Range Rover started to change. Now, in 1981, the first 5-door Range Rover came out, and that was followed a year later by the automatic. In 1980, Land Rover had played around with the idea of having a posh Range Rover, so there were a few Range Rovers called in vogue. And the name obviously comes from the Vogue magazine because it was that magazine that the car was featured in. And in 1984, the Range Rover Vogue became a proper model, and the transformation from farmer's workhorse to wheels suitable for Chelsea and Knightsbridge was complete. And the rest, as they say, is history.
That could have been it for the Velar name, but it was hauled out of the history books this year, and it now graces a brand new model, the 4th to wear the Range Rover badge. Sitting between the Evoque and the Range Rover Sport, the new Velar is all about style and form, and a far cry from the original. So if you're considering buying a new Range Rover Evoque, a Sport, the new Velar, or even the Big Daddy Range Rover, just remember how